Thank you.
Hi. For for those of you might first join the ITS seminar, I'm Siwei Hu, a third-year PhD student at ITS, and I would first like to say welcome to ITS, welcome to ITS seminar. Today we are very honored to have Professor Joseph DiMento to speak with us. Professor Joseph DiMento is a distinguished professor of law and of business, transportation science, and planning at the University of California, Irvine. His area of research and teaching are urban planning and land use and international and domestic environmental law. He is also author and co-authors of 14 books, including Changing Lanes, Vision and Histories of Urban Freeways, and Environmental Governance of Great Seas, and also climate change. He has written and lectured on infrastructure of many kinds, including urban freeways. He's a board member of UCI Law Center on Land, Natural Resources, and Environment. And he also directed the Newkirk Center for Science and Society. And please join me in a warm applause welcome. Welcome, Professor DiMento, and we'll give it to Professor DiMento.
Thank you, Siwei. It's a pleasure to be here. You see the title of my talk. I want to say at the start that I want to thank Siwei and the other sponsors of this program for doing this, giving us, I consider this an interactive session, the opportunity to discuss these important and sensitive issues. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my involvement in the area of infrastructure and social justice, give some examples of the situations of infrastructure development that we're all involved in, address questions that are fundamental to our understanding of social justice and infrastructure. Who benefits from these projects? Who is harmed by the projects? What can be done to mitigate harm and make reparations if possible for that harm? I'm going to talk about the special case in American history of the American highway system and the decision to cite interstate highways through central business districts, and address to a certain extent motivations behind what some are now interpreting as slum clearance. Talk a little bit about other national and international infrastructure cases. And then in light of the spirit of congratulating you for having these seminars, address questions of how this history and how these differential costs and benefits challenge our professions and the roles that we play and can play. Finally, discussing some solutions we hope that are being put into place and will be put into place to increase equity. I've been involved in land use and development for decades, starting my professional career not as an academic, but as a planner in a model cities program, which was an early inner city poverty program with a focus on involving the Black community in decision-making about a wide range of projects that would affect them. In that case, most of them were social projects rather than infrastructure projects. I've been involved with environmental law and its various understandings of what is social justice since its very start, since the roots of environmental law. And in the middle of my career, added a very strong emphasis on international environmental law and development. And I will talk a little bit about that as well. I teach a course on land use and development control law that has evolved with our understandings, or at least some of our evolved understandings. Others lived it, so they didn't need these understandings. Evolving understandings of the differential impacts of what some saw as neutral decisions about land use and development, the impacts of those projects and laws and orientations on people of color and other minorities. I also teach, as Siwei said, and write about climate change. And increasingly, we're seeing or beginning to appreciate more fully the differential impacts of climate change on various communities and the extent to which infrastructure decision-making has affected communities in ways that relate to climate change. And then my baby, the urban freeway, which I started writing about decades ago when I was asked to do a project on the Century 105 freeway and its history, and have never looked back about freeways. I'd like to point out that the work on social justice and infrastructure and land use is increasingly being brought to the attention of students and the American people in general. Richard Rothstein, who has lectured here, wrote a book a few years ago based on his experience that is a very important look back at the relationship between the law and discrimination and absence of social justice. As he said, we didn't get here by accident. The decisions that were made with regard to land use and other areas of local, state, and federal law were in many situations oriented directly toward segregation and discrimination. So I will comment a little bit on his book and encourage those of you who have not seen it to take a look at it. In his book, The Color of Law, he points out that at all levels of government, the federal, the state, and the local, but also in the private sector, there have been deliberate efforts to use law in order to promote a segregated society. Perhaps the most widely impactful was using public housing as a segregating agent, where public housing was cited, the way that public housing was built and who was to be the inhabitants of public housing. Also in the area of exclusionary zoning laws, in our course on land use and development control, we go back to the early 1900s and see how the development of zoning, sometimes deliberately and sometimes de facto, led to exclusionary areas that excluded certain groups from that part of the community. There were, of course, specific anti-Chinese zoning laws, but there were also exclusionary zoning laws that impacted African Americans in very direct and serious ways, including by creating spot rezoning so that certain areas would be designated in ways that would continue to promote what was a segregated society and reinforce that segregation. At the federal level, the blatant federal loan discrimination that occurred through the federal government activities of providing loans was a serious chapter in our story, where the federal housing authorities specifically characterize certain areas, African American areas, as risky for loans, and avoided giving loans in those areas. That was coupled with redlining at the private sector, loaning the banks that would literally redline communities and decide that they would not give mortgages in those communities because they were they were considered risky under federal policy. Some of it was a little less blatant and continues to our day. Zoning laws that reserve neighborhoods for single family residences in situations where, because of the major wage gaps between Black Americans and white Americans, that single family residences were effectively unaffordable to many African American people. At the private sector approach, writing into housing contracts restrictive covenants. You can only sell this house to people of the Caucasian race. That was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a very famous case, Shelley versus Kramer. But some of those covenants still exist. They are unenforceable, but like other covenants, carry on as homeowners associations, and property documents are not updated. And there are many other examples of this use of the law to promote and to concretize the injustices that exist in America today. What does it have to do with us? We're engineers and planners and lawyers, and we, at the national, state, and local level, facilitate and implement a wide variety of infrastructure projects that have effects, and those are differential effects. Some of them, the effects are not immediately obvious and seem like they're neutral activities, and some of them are, but some of them are not. Where do we locate light rail routes and why? Where do the major hazardous waste facilities get sited and why? Where does the bullet train go? Infrastructure of all kinds, and I'm sure in the discussion, or if anyone wants to enter now, situations where you see that these big projects are not neutral in the impacts they have on people of color. And these are just a few examples. Transfer stations that are put in areas that are the communities of Mexican Americans and other minority communities. Of course, these transfer stations bring jobs. They also displace housing. They also, where they don't displace housing, create air pollution impacts, noise pollution impacts, and do so in a way that affects people who live very close to them and whose lives are affected in ways that aren't resolved by the use of eminent domain, that they're paid fair market value, either because those properties don't need to be legally condemned because they aren't actually going to be built upon, or because the inhabitants are renters and they are not the beneficiaries of the just compensation under the 5th and 14th Amendment of the Constitution and the California Constitution. Where do we put our major infrastructure highways and our bridges? This is Steve, Professor Richie May. Siwei, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Joseph. I have a quick question. I remember in the seminar, like several weeks ago by Professor Thomas Sanchez, and he mentioned a very interesting phenomenon. For example, in the Washington, D.C. area, the wealthy area like Georgetown, they just opt out the subway system. They think maybe the subway system might bring criminals to their area. So they just vote to do not let the subway system get into the Georgetown. So there's the only way to go to Georgetown maybe by driving or some bus lines. And also there is a county in the Atlanta area. They also opt out the lightweight for the same reasons. What do you think of that? Is there any ways to address that kind of phenomenon that some wealthy people don't want the public transit to go through their area?
That's a fundamental a question in our discussion today. If local governments and their citizens, including through the use of the ballot box or initiative, if they vote out projects that are designed to assist in transportation or housing of low and moderate income people, in minority people, African Americans, or even socioeconomic discrimination, what are the available options for addressing that? There are many, not all of them are effective. One of those is if it's blatant use of the decision-making power to discriminate, the lawsuits of the kind I'll describe when we see how the Century Freeway was actually expedited. Lawsuits are a way. There are laws also now with regard to, you're talking about rail and the metro system in the Washington area. But there are also, with regard to housing, there are now laws that have come into effect in many communities, most recently in California under Mr. Weiner's leadership, that preclude local governments from having single-family zoning and preclude local governments from using their discretionary powers to preclude the provision of affordable housing. I think you'll see the approaches that can be used as we move further through the slides.
Thank you, Professor Joseph. I thought there also a question from the chat from Wiki.
The Professor Richie may remember a very famous article, a planning article called A Desire Named Streetcar. It's the kind of title I always find fascinating. I wish I had thought of that. For those of you who don't know, there is a remarkably famous movie and book called A Streetcar Named Desire. And what this pun is intended to point out is that some of our decisions with regard to light rail seem at the one hand very important and neutral because they're trying to promote accessibility for all peoples in the community. They're trying to promote movement to get us out of the single passenger automobile for climate change and air pollution purposes. And that is one story about light rail. There are other stories that ask the question, who's paying for this and where are these light rail systems going? Whose interests are they in? Where are they being cited? Who benefits from them? And you see this citation from the Census Bureau. The number of African-American workers in rail accessible neighborhoods has declined in recent years, while those in white neighborhoods have increased. Rail accessible neighborhoods have a higher proportion of high income workers. What does that say about Siwei's question about Georgetown? Well, that is a particular part of public transportation history, a very high income, very, at the time still is, prestigious community that for reasons of several different kinds did not want rail in its community, in part because it is close enough to make the residents to make their way into the central business district in the center of Washington, D.C. So another area of infrastructure. Are there any comments or questions?
Questions in chat, Joe.
Yeah, I have a question and I received a note to actually ask it in person. So I'm going to go back to the way I wrote it to make sure I ask it the same way. So I had two questions, and my background comes from eminent domain. So I've sort of have a personal interest as well as experience in seeing these kind of projects happen. And I've always wondered how we could handle the following. One of the objectives, at least that my understanding is of projects, is to minimize costs, right? And that's easy to do. You can quantify that. Minimizing disruption is a little bit more difficult to quantify. And I'm wondering how we counter the mandate to find the most cost-effective, the best and most cost-effective route or location for public works projects. And I'm sort of tying it to the fact that the lower the cost of acquisition, the more likely the community is marginalized to begin with. So you don't see, freeways running through the center of, say, a very high-end business district, because the land value and the acquisition costs would be prohibitive. How do we deal with that worthy goal of being cost-effective while still being sensitive to the impacts of these projects on those who've been acquired, or worse, adjacent and not acquired?
Yes, I'm sure you have some thoughts as I ask my students, pose a question and then answer it, but I will give you some thoughts. Cost effectiveness and cost benefit analyses are are tools that can be manipulated in very, very robust ways. Whose benefits, effectiveness in what sense? So activism on the part of those who are the victims of projects that have negative impacts on their community is one response. The notion that we're trying to minimize costs with some of these projects is, Vicky, almost laughable, because they are so immensely expensive. And the most pessimistic predictions of how much the bullet train will cost or how much light rail will cost end up not being the most pessimistic. So the funds are found independent of where the projects are, if there is either a mandate, a legal mandate, or political willingness to go forward. With the point about minimizing disruption, again, disruption to whom, and how do we define disruption? As we get to be more scientifically educated about what disruption means, some of these concerns can be addressed through existing legal instruments. It's very disruptive to have air pollution going in your bedroom because the freeway ramp was sited 100 feet from your apartment. So the disruptions can be addressed through the use of tools like environmental impact assessment, done well and pursued by the type of activism that led to the resolution of the Century Freeway project, which did go through neighborhoods, and I will elaborate on that when we get to that part of the urban freeway focus of the talk. But how about your thoughts, Vicki?
You know, I think the challenge is that some things are easy to quantify, even though they're a minimal amount of the project. And I would agree completely that the acquisition costs are a drop in the bucket when you look at, you know, the impacts. And certainly if you look at a long-term perspective, almost anything we spend today is going to be minimally impactful years down the road, especially as long as infrastructure would last, which arguably for a freeway could be forever. I think the challenge is a couple of things. One is quantity versus qualitative, you know, comparisons. And the other, I think, is the disruptive to whom, right? So we could agree that a freeway running, I think the 710 or the 710 is another good example, very similar to the Century Freeway, where it got to the point where it stopped when it impacted the people who had power, right? So it's just tough. And I don't know. The reason I asked you is I don't have an answer myself. It's so hard to make those kind of judgments that can't be quantified, right? So, I mean, the argument could be made that no matter where you put a freeway, you're going to impact someone, right? You run the high-speed rail through the Central Valley, you impact them, you impact the wildlife crossing, but those people aren't very good at being advocates for themselves, or the wildlife, I mean. So I don't have the answer. If I did, I wouldn't have asked. It's progress, right? Frogtown is another good example, you know, the 5 bisecting them. There's so many. And then my other question, which sort of goes with this, is even if you do change your goals, there's only so much enforcement that one has. And an example that I always think of is the city of San Marino, that to my knowledge has no multifamily zoning, despite a federal mandate to do so. And the only suffering that they had, if you can call it suffering, was a loss of federal highway funds, which they didn't need anyway. They obviously don't want, you know, they don't want that type of infrastructure. As Shiwei noted, many communities do not want access, right? For their own personal reasons, they don't need it. They don't want you, and they don't want to, they have easy ways of getting where they need to go. So I don't have a solution. That's why I asked you. I hoped maybe you did.
Well, we will, was there a comment? We will keep these questions, this question in mind as we go through. There are a number of parts of what you're saying. The San Marino case is an interesting one. And Vicky, you say the absence of enforcement. Enforcement is something that can occur in a number of ways, and the new pushes at the state level and with the state housing department to pursue the cases where, like Huntington Beach a couple years ago, there was a failure to reach the designated fair share of affordable housing. That's one approach. There are now, I don't know San Marino well, but there are also some internal pressures, vectors that may assist there. I doubt it would happen there, but one of the people in our audience today is a student of mine who's working on the impacts of these new California state law on increasing affordability. What will be the impacts if neighbors decide in San Marino, we're going to sell our lot because now, although it's worth a lot now, if it had 4 units on it, it will be worth a whole lot more. So there may be some internal dynamics that affect affordability. I think I'm not Pollyannish about this because for many reasons, but there are some internal dynamics. But let's keep this in mind as we move through more of our conversations. I have to step away for just 2 minutes. You folks can chat should you choose to do so, and I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. Any further thoughts, Vicky? Yeah, it's a pretty.
Yeah, it's been happening. For those of you who kind of haven't followed it, I mean, it's a constant, in development, right? We, under the seemingly noble arguments of better for everyone, right? And lower costs, we tend to, in my view, we tend to run infrastructure through the communities that can least afford, and I use that term broadly, to deal with it, right? And if this topic interests you, there are really good instances of communities that were just completely bisected by freeways. And if you can imagine living in a community and having a freeway run right through the center of it, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine that it completely destroys the community in so many ways. If nothing else, one half of the community can't access the other half, right?
Yeah.
And it's tough. I working personally on these projects, I see where it's hard to make the argument to move something because people are going to be impacted. It seems like maybe it would be easy to make that argument, but it's a very difficult argument to make. So.
Oh, for the case in the city of Irvine, I think the I-5 and 405 go through the Irvine. There's a triangle.
Mm-hmm.
I think from my perspective, I don't think there's much segregation when the freeway crosses over the Irvine.
Yeah, Irvine's a little bit different, and maybe Professor Ritchie can jump in if I have it wrong, because I'm not. Most of my work that I had done was north of it, but the 405 and the 5, I think, predate all the development of the city, right? So the city was purposely developed around those freeways, so you wouldn't see a negative impact because the freeways happened before the city did.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's true, Vicky. I can
Yeah.
remember back in the early 80s, which is
The strawberry
millennium.
field, yeah.
Yeah, strawberry fields. We actually had a house at one point where they had been strawberry fields in the 5
Right, right. And so in Irvine, by the way, those of you whose most of your experience has been Irvine, you're not going to sort of experience this because Irvine was master planned, meaning the roads came in at the same time as the development. And the challenge happens when the development needs to come in after the community is established. So the only thing disrupted by the roads in Irvine, as Steve was pointing out, are the strawberry plants that, you know, were moved. So you have a very different experience in a master plan community, but you might want to look sometime if you just, or actually just take Metrolink up to LA and look at the homes that are adjacent to the freeway and adjacent to the rail line. And you'll see that it does not look like the homes that you would see in Irvine adjacent to infrastructure, if that makes sense.
One of the activities we do in the land use course is take a field trip on the blue line to the green line to the red line to the purple line in LA, and the differences of land use and housing and mixed use along the way are, for some students, eye openers, and for others, they understood this before. But should we continue, or am I interrupting a line of communication, a conversation?
We could move forward with the presentation, Professor Joseph.
Pardon me?
I think we could move forward with your presentation.
Thank you.
No inter-
Other major infrastructure projects that amazing, remarkably expensive, and who benefits from them. Some of them are just everyday projects that we're involved in. Not all of us will be working on the Three Rivers Dam or on an airport siting. Small projects, works that mixed use, commercial use, housing decisions that can lead to gentrification, which has its benefits, but also has its costs. Super streets, Vicki pointed out, Irvine is a place that's planned, a planned community. It is also a community that has speed limits of 50 to 55 in the middle of neighborhood areas. Considered a benefit. It is a benefit if you're going from one side of Irvine to another. It's less of a benefit if you're a senior citizen trying to cross from UC Irvine to Mason Regional Park. One of the small projects that is part of the history of injustice in the United States is 8 Mile. Some of you know 8 Mile from the rap singing about it, but there, because communities that were adjacent to Black communities were unable to get financial assistance from the federal housing sources, literally had constructed a wall that would preclude movement, or at least act as a symbolic obstacle to the integration of Blacks and whites, allowing the residents in, or future residents in the white areas to get access to federal mortgages. So some of the projects are quite small. I'm not going to ask you to go to this site now, but I would suggest it if you haven't seen this article. It's quite dramatically done and convincing about the relationship between the impacts of housing decisions historically and neighborhoods of color, that the zoning patterns establish situations where the low and moderate income people and African Americans live in areas with much less access to neighborhood parks and areas where one can cool off, much more impacted by asphalt and other heat trapping infrastructure. And that in part because of the history of redlining and racism that led to where they in fact would be living. It's a very well done piece by the New York Times. So we're talking about our roles. Vicki talked about her role. I hope you all chime in and talking about your role. I will move on, and please do contribute based on your experiences. I see this as a period, and that's why I applauded Shiwei and others who have put this together to think back on what we have, some of us have considered neutral decisions that are being made about the overall good of society that really have implications that are not equitable in many contexts, whether we're working at the government level, whether we're working in the private sector, whether we're working in the corporate sector. We developed these standard operating procedures for moving the urban freeway system that I will do a case study of in a couple of minutes. This is how engineers cited freeways in that period 60 years ago. The standard operating procedure was the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That straight line went through Syracuse or went through Linwood or went through Washington, D.C. Some of that has been interpreted as blatantly racist, and some of it, I'm sure was. Some of it was based on orientations of as Vicki said, cost-effective routes to move goods and services in the interstate system. Now my baby, urban freeways. I'll talk a little bit about the general history of urban freeways, the strong influence of engineers and how they were cited, how I first encountered an urban freeway, and then my long-term interest in the Century Freeway, and how it has been a case study of at least some success compared to what the Century Freeway would have looked like if not for Judge Pragerson and the Center for Law and the Public Interest and the evolution of federal laws that affect the citing and impacts of major infrastructure. This is my neighborhood. I lived over here, and this used to be a place of Italian American bakeries and other places I would walk to. This is the period of in which obviously it's being constructed, the Interstate 81 freeway that goes from Canada to far south through New York State. The impacts were greatest. You might say, how could they be greater than this? We weren't physically removed from the community. The impacts were greatest in something called the 15th Ward. And the 15th Ward was an integrated neighborhood of Jewish Americans and Black Americans. that was raised in order to provide access. The route of the interstate freeway through the city of Syracuse. Why would we put freeways through cities? Well, the question, what was broken? Why did we need freeways through cities? What would, in the minds of people making decisions at the time, what would the freeways look like? Remember, we were becoming increasingly a world of transportation via automobile. Looking back, things were broken. This is a center city on a typical workday, and congestion was extraordinarily bad in many cities, including in the case studies that I address in Changing Lanes, Visions, and Histories of Urban Freeways. So transportation planners, other planners, were looking for ways of relieving congestion. The concern was, with that congestion, there would be a degradation of the central business district, and commerce would begin to degrade in that community and that part of the district. And so communities started to look for urban redevelopment in order to address the problems associated with congestion, but also, and this is where the story gets very sensitive, also to address the challenge of maintaining segregation and opposing the integration of African Americans into other parts of the community. I must say, and others, I will cite this to you in a minute, I must say that in all of my documentation in the Syracuse case, unlike with other cases that we did, I did not find explicit official statements of the racist or reasons for citing the freeway where it was. There was a white flight throughout the United States. People were moving into suburbs that looked like this, and they were moving there, but still working in downtown areas and the central business district. And urban freeways would allow them to get into town to shop and to work, and back out to the white suburbs where they live. So a little bit about the history and vision of these infrastructures. Some of the ideas for addressing the congestion were quite hilarious. This is a particular graphic that I wondered what happens to these people up here after they make their way smoothly through the city of New York or wherever this was. But some of the visions were visions that were romanticized. There were limited access, divided parkways in the United States at the time that freeways were to be built through the cities. And I think many who did not have the benefit of hindsight that we have now saw the intercity freeway as looking somewhat like the Hudson Parkway or the Washington DC parkways, or even the Pasadena, which became a freeway and then is no longer meets the standards of freeways. And the visions occurred, and this is well worth looking at. I'm not going to ask that you try to find it now, but at home, the 1939 World's Fair envisioned freeways as a futuristic, benign way of developing the America after in the middle of the century, and doing so in a way that saw the seamless movement of traffic throughout throughout new futuristic cities where pedestrians and automobiles and commerce and residents would all be integrated in a very positive way. Now, a few case study comments, and we will move on. In 1947, the federal government outlined a program of 40,000 miles of interstate freeways. Almost 3,000 miles of those would be in urban areas. In 1945, the Association of State Highway Officials submitted its interstate design standards to the Bureau of Public Roads. Those standards were called for minimum widths of freeways, geometric designs, and spacing of interchanges. Some of the freeways in the inner city area that were planned were built. Some, as Vicky pointed out, were not built. You don't take the Malibu freeway now, do you? You don't take the Beverly Hills freeway now, do you? They were stopped. But some were built, and some were stopped, and some were mitigated. And that's gets to what Vicky and I were having our conversation about. What can we do? And the Interstate 105 indicates some of what we can do. There are many other examples of intercity freeways that were either stopped or built, and some of those have had direct some of the decisions to build them have been associated by colleagues of mine in their research with specific racist orientations and to maintain segregation. If Shiwei can put this Flint, Michigan video on for 5 minutes, I think it would be enlightening. If it's too complicated, I just suggest you look at it at some point. You think you're able to do that, Shiwei?
Yeah, I think I could. Let me quickly share. Maybe share this now. So is this video, Professor Joseph?
That's it. I don't know if people can see it or hear it.
It wasn't just a matter of individuals.
Thank you.
Can you hear the sound?
Yeah, we can hear it. Thanks.
Making decisions based on their own biases. But the decision to bulldoze a neighborhood and replace it with an efficient mechanism to get people out of the city from their work had a real consequence for us, and it was a bad choice. And we have paid a price for that. As a society, we paid a price, and as a community, we continue to pay a price for that.
I heard that they was gonna bulldoze the neighborhood, urban renew it is what they did. They brought the highway through part of it. So they had to get rid of the neighborhood because we were just in the way.
The federal highway system became the lifeblood of the United Country, a 20th century version of the Transcontinental Railroad. But the decision of where to build those new roads became a tool for strengthening white supremacy, a last gasp ahead of the civil rights movement's apex.
A lot of white citizens were fleeing the community because of racism. I mean, it was in 1967 that we passed our open housing ordinance here. The first one in the country to do so, and we did it by referendum. And unfortunately, part of the effect of that was racism sort of took over the conversation.
In planning the routes of the automotive age asphalt connective tissue, community after community after community would decide that the new development required destruction of black neighborhoods. That includes the St. John's neighborhood in Flint, Michigan.
It was disastrous for us. And I didn't know, right now I can't even think how I felt that we had to move, because then we felt that we were leaving all our family and nobody was gonna be there. It was just gonna be a road in a minute.
The St. John's neighborhood had a long, rich history when the city of Flint utilized its power of eminent domain to displace over 1,500 families.
The consequences of so-called urban renewal. My parents and a lot of the adults that I grew up with, they had worked hard, they had bought their homes, they had paid off their homes, and now they learned that they had to purchase another home, get another mortgage. It was kind of traumatic, being forced to move from some place that you had been all your life.
The city uprooted, displaced, and otherwise removed every one of those families from the enclave that had been one of the few areas where blacks were allowed to reside and prosper.
We weren't allowed to go out of that area, to live. We couldn't just buy a house where we wanted to live. So we were confined. But then when we started opening our own businesses and the money started staying in the community, that didn't settle. That just wasn't what they wanted. It's just like that Tulsa, Oklahoma type thing. It was just too much. They didn't want it like that.
I think it was devious. I think it was racist. And again, it speaks to the fact that residents, the people themselves, didn't have a voice in a decision. Because if they had a voice, it would have never happened.
The encroachment of the highway also destroyed scores of businesses, an entire community, along with its people's hopes, dreams, and way of life, gone forever.
The consequences was the gain of busting up or breaking up a strong urban community, and also providing a freeway for those that go up north all the time instead of taking I-75. But it was racist. It was discriminatory. It was a bad plan.
It's been over 50 years since that cherished history was lost, denied future generations, and nearly forgotten. Rediscover what was taken from this community through the eyes of those who once called the St. John's neighborhood home.
Folks don't realize that they dropped a bomb in Flint. But the name of that bomb was I-475.
We didn't matter. And it took us a long time before we found that out. We didn't matter in the early times that we was there, but we found out later that we really didn't matter.
We were not alone here in the city of Flint. I know it happened in Detroit, down Hastings Avenue in that area called Black Bottom. It happened in Chicago. It happened all over the country. And I feel like this was something that was part of the great plan.
Wow, it was a sad video.
Thank you, Shiwei. Thank you very much. I want to point out, let's see, I want to get back to, am I sharing my screen now or not again?
No. Can you reshare?
Not yet, right?
Now we can see it.
You can?
Yeah, we could.
Okay. I wanted to point out that the producer of that video, I think is in the audience now. I don't want to call him out unless he wishes to identify himself. And I look forward to seeing the complete video when it is done. Vicky had earlier asked the question of what can be done, and one of the speakers in the film used the word "we didn't have a voice," and that gets to the question of those situations where freeways were stopped or mitigated and people had voices, and I want to talk briefly about that now. By the way, I won't talk about my own city at the time, but you see here what I said about standard operating procedures. I lived here. The freeway was going to Canada and down into Pennsylvania, shortest distance, go right through the city. There's a new ACLU article out about Syracuse that finds more explicit racial motivation than I did. And it is available here if you want to read it. In Memphis, the freeway was stopped. That is one of the major case studies in changing lanes, and you can read about that to understand how it was. But our Los Angeles up the street case is, I think, an important one to address the questions we're about. What can be done? And this is now a couple decades old, but it was done, not perfectly, but in ways that show how people do get the voice that they need in order to try to mitigate the negative impacts on their communities. Here is the original plan for freeways coming through the Los Angeles area. This is the corridor of the I-105. This is what the communities looked like before it went in. This is part of that area now. It was called the freeway of the century, or the freeway with a heart. Well, how can a freeway have a heart? How can it be a model? It is a very interesting case because it goes to the question of how voice can be given to those who are affected by infrastructure projects that have negative impacts on them, their families, their communities. And it goes to the role of law working for people versus law in the service of those who want to promote segregation. The freeway of the century was called that way because of its active involvement, its participation of those who were to be affected by the freeway, its focus on design that would minimize the impacts of the freeway on neighboring communities, its commitment to putting transit in the median of the freeway, transit that does serve low and moderate income people. But these two are particularly important elements. Employment for those who were displaced, employment and training for those who lived in the corridor, and replacement housing for those who lived in the corridor. And this came about in large part through a remarkable effort by the Center for Law in the Public Interest and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where a lawsuit was brought to stop the California Highway Commission, the Caltrans, from going forward with the freeway according to the way it was originally planned. And that involved the public interest law firm using, again, with named plaintiffs who included African Americans in the corridor, using the evolving and more enlightened laws of the late 60s and mainly early 70s that address some of the inequities that come with the development of infrastructure. The Department of Transportation Act requiring the need to look for alternative approaches and minimize the impact of the freeway on urban communities. The National Historic Preservation Act, which was important in forcing decisions that attempted to mitigate these takings of downtown areas on historically important communities. The Federal Aid Highway Act, and importantly, the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires for a project like the Century Freeway, an environmental impact statement, looking at alternatives, looking at mitigation measures, looking at ways of minimizing the impact on the community, and requiring periods of comment, not only by the people in the community, but by neighboring communities and affected entities. The Clean Air Act, which came into power authority at the beginning of the controversy over the Century Freeway, laws that required relocation, housing relocation payments for those who would be displaced by the freeway. So it was a sea change in state and federal regulation, but going to the point of who is the voice, it was a sea change that was choreographed by a public interest law firm and moved through a court that was, moved through Judge Pragerson's court, who he guided the discussions, the negotiations, the implementation of this consent decree which is a settlement that requires the required Caltrans to provide housing, which required the creation of a citizens advisory board that required the hiring of people, minority businesses in the corridor, that required the hiring of women, female led businesses in the corridor, and required the freeway being built only along with the provision of housing for those who had been displaced. That's what I'll say about urban freeways. We're running out of time. I know that some of you will also be involved in international work, which can have extraordinarily big impacts on local communities, including indigenous communities, either through the construction of major dams, through activities where multinationals are brought in to do resource exploration and exploitation. I can answer questions about this, but some of these projects involve human rights violations that displace indigenous people or have other human rights impacts. And here too, although more slowly and less dramatically, there have been legal responses that at least start to work in the direction of more social justice, including the requirement under international law to consult with indigenous peoples on about major development projects that affect their lands, to do environmental impact assessments, including in transboundary contexts where one nation is building a giant dam and it has serious impacts on the lives of people in another nation, requiring participation of those who are affected by these major infrastructure projects, requiring their participation, and including the lawsuits that are brought and can be brought before international tribunals to address injustices imposed by some of these projects. And in part of what we call soft law that is used in some of these challenges is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So now we have some time for questions or discussion, or to go out and start the weekend. I'm happy to address questions and ask you questions, but now it is our grad students and our students who are educating themselves to use the resources that are available and the institutions that are available to reverse some of the injustices that have occurred over the last several decades.
Thank you, Professor Joseph. Please join me in a warm applause. Thank you, Professor Joseph, for your excellent talk. And then for the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we will moderate the question. And so Professor Ricci has a question.
Okay, thanks, Siwei, for letting me jump in first. Joe, I just wanted to thank you so much for your presentation and taking the time to join us this morning. It was really a fascinating and really important presentation. I wanted to make one comment. You spoke a lot in the context of really traditional infrastructure, but I just wanted to point out that for our students in particular, that so many of these issues correspond and are going to be of equal or greater importance as we move forward in implementing new technologies and new approaches. And one particular thing comes to mind. I mean, another one has to do with autonomous vehicles, and if they're operating on dedicated guideways, it's kind of like freeway construction. But the state is just beginning to grapple with the issue of advanced air mobility. And, you know, on one hand, you think of drones, but also like air taxis for movement of goods. You could think of e-commerce, last mile sort of delivery things, but also moving people. And UC Berkeley is initiating and has created a senior administrative position at the vice chancellor level for creating a new campus at Moffett Field up there to study advanced air mobility. And they're talking about using these, ultimately, these craft for ferrying people, maybe initially between UC campuses, but ultimately the idea is maybe optimistically for an Uber Air kind of situation for ferrying people from location to location. But then that raises issues of, well, where are these landing ports and where are you going to put them and who has access and what's the cost? And it kind of seems like it's, I guess I'm digressing a little bit here, but it seems like it's going to be something that is initially going to be really just for the affluent. But where are they going to place these things? And so there are issues as we look at the deployment of new technologies that we think are going to solve so many problems, but are probably going to present the same kinds of issues that you have discussed with respect to traditional infrastructure.
That's wonderful, Steve. And I think we all should add that to what we think about when we're thinking about infrastructure. Berkeley has its own challenges with inclusion and involvement of the local communities. But I'm fascinated by that, and it's almost frightening to think of drones taking people from Merced to Berkeley.
Yeah. I mean, they really are talking about moving folks, say, between Davis and Berkeley, but the idea is ultimately, you know, statewide. But yeah, so anyway, I'll let others raise some questions too.
Any further questions? I saw Vicky unmute.
I have a question. I would think, I am not an engineer, but I would think that engineers might feel that they're, and rightly so, that their role is very narrowly defined, right? The questions are at grade, not at grade, straight line, curved line, that sort of thing. What role in all of this could engineers play? Or what positive role could engineers play?
Ask an engineer.
Steve?
Maybe Professor Reach, you could address the question.
Well, good question, right? I mean, it's perhaps not so much engineers, but the education of engineers, right? And so the issue probably really falls to us in terms of how we educate our students before they go out into practice. And so it's education, and I mean, that influences institutional values and perceptions and the techniques that are used for evaluation of projects. And so the range of impacts, I think we need to stress in our educational system. I mean, we're still struggling clearly from the comments that Joe and you made too, in terms of trying to quantify these things, because as engineers, we like to quantify everything, right? And quantification and identification of costs, how do we really measure impacts? These are all issues that we need to be more sensitive to. This is not a particularly satisfactory answer, I know, but I think it actually comes back to us as educators.
Yes, and engineers, like others, are heavily involved in considering alternatives to proposed projects, and those alternatives are often based on engineering solutions that can be solutions enlightened by the type of education that we're doing here at UCI. The freeway need not go right through that, beyond that straight line, right through that neighborhood. There are alternatives to that. The drones taking people from Merced to Berkeley may not be the best way to move people or ideas from one campus to another. Steve's telling us about that project, and I had heard a little bit about it. It falls into a desire named streetcars. We can build these Uber taxis, we can build drones, we can build hyperlinks like Musk says, to bring us to Las Vegas, or to address traffic congestion in the Los Angeles basin. But engineers are very involved and very expert in telling us some of the impacts of those engineering solutions and alternatives to them. So I think there's a very big role for engineers.
Yeah, and it's not just engineers, obviously, it's also, you could say, breaking down the silos, which we try to do on campus, ITS being an example, but other efforts as well in terms of interdisciplinary study, obviously connecting with the communities, but even professionally, amongst the professions, talking to each other and gaining different perspectives. And then obviously the community participation and listening as well. Not a lot of listening often gets done.
Thanks for Professor Richie's comments. We still have a couple minutes. We might take one or two questions. I saw Mr. Ronnie Brown and Mr. Julius Caesars open your camera. Any comments and questions? Please just feel free to unmute yourself. Hi, Julius.
I know. I wanted to sort of I think reinforce or maybe add into or supplement onto Professor Rich's comment on breaking down the silos and sort of encouraging the interdisciplinary kind of education, because I feel like we as engineers or mathematicians or STEM students normally assume that our work is independent of social issues or social histories, which it never is. Any project or any human being, any perspective is always grounded within the social history of a society. So I feel like making engineers aware of that at the very beginning of the education would go a long way, because in many times engineers have no idea that even if they're engineers, they're not separate from the social ideologies and perspectives and histories and biases of communities. So
I think that's a very good point, Julius. And this slide that says, we see this a lot in as we're trying to bring indigeneity and inclusion studies into all our courses at the law school. And we hear, well, what can what I teach possibly have to do with race and justice? And the short answer is what all of us do has to do with race and justice, whether it's tax, engineering, human rights. If you don't see it, be open to learning how to see what our neutral, supposedly neutral attitudes and decisions have to do with race and justice. Well, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. Again, Steve's group and the graduate students over there have been really leaders in bringing these ideas to the campus, and I hope that momentum maintains.
Thank you, Joe.
I think we still have 2 minutes. If there's any last minute question that want to or comments want to jump on, please feel free. but we do want to honor Professor Joseph time and the audience time. But please feel free to add any comments.
I don't want to dominate the conversation. I feel like I have been. I have so many questions, but I would just like to say thank you so much for bringing this seminar to us. It's not a topic that we always see in the context of engineering. And as I think you can tell from the interaction, it should be.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Maybe next time there will be 115 people in the audience.
Oh, we look forward to. Yeah,
Take good care and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Joseph DiMento. Would you mind if we share your slides with the students after the seminar?
I'd be very happy if you did.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you, Professor Joseph, for your time and effort putting the presentation together. And have a great weekend to Professor Joseph and all the audience.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you.